As investigations into this very high-profile missing persons case continues, the footprint was discovered near a dam about 5 kilometres from the homestead near Yunta, where Gus disappeared on grand final night 10 days ago.
Whoa. Hold on, what was that?
5 kilometres from the homestead near Yunta, where Gus disappeared on grand final night 10 days ago.
One more time, let's listen carefully.
Gus disappeared on grand final night, grand final night.
The 2025 AFL Grand Final was an Australian rules football match contested between the Geelong Football Club and the Brisbane Lions at the Melbourne Cricket Ground on Saturday, 27 September 2025. Any guesses what time the final happened and what time Gus vanished? Right, it was 5 p.m. on Saturday, September 27th. This is not in dispute. Gus Lamont was last seen playing on a mound of dirt, not just dirt, a mound of dirt, at about 5 p.m. on Saturday, September 27th. How did they know that it was at 5 p.m.? How could they be so specific? Well, wasn't it because that game was on right then and there? It turns out the AFL Grand Final typically ends just after 5 p.m. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time. Depending on quarter lengths and whether extra time is required, those folks in Australia who watch the game, can you say at what time exactly the game ended, especially the folks in South Australia? Can I just say, I have a small dog, a miniature schnauzer, and when I take him outside for a walk, he's never out of my sight for more than 1 or 2 minutes. I doubt that I've lost sight of him ever for more than 5 minutes. And this is a dog, not a child. I don't think it's overstating it to say leaving Gus alone for half an hour was a serious error in judgment, especially given the terrain surrounding the station. Have you had a close look at that terrain? Just have a look at this deep hole excavated right beside one of the buildings, and you notice there is no safety cordon around it. And former William Tyrrell investigator says South Australian police are looking at other possibilities in the disappearance of the boy. Well, how about this possibility? What if when Gus was unsupervised and when the AFL final was just wrapping up, and what if the AFL final was the thing that was diverting attention away from this child? What if something serious happened to him? Technically, it wasn't anyone's fault, but imagine a scenario where you potentially have to explain a deceased child on your property. And what if someone took matters into their own hands and buried Gus close to home, possibly even in a hole that was already there? And if there were building materials on hand, perhaps that could have been used to seal him off. This scenario would explain the lack of evidence, not only a lack of footprints, but also a lack of scent.
According to available accounts, he was last seen about 5 p.m., a small figure against the endless red horizon. Within roughly 30 minutes he was gone. That narrow window, the minutes between play and alarm, shapes everything investigators and the family must now face. Timing is the most concrete piece of the puzzle we have, and every other detail must be read against it. The fact that the AFL Grand Final was ending near the same time and diverting attention in the household, the absence of clear footprints, scent trails or dropped items at the scene, and the worrying presence of fresh excavations and uncordoned holes nearby that raise both safety and evidentiary concerns. Taken together, these elements demand a thorough and careful re-examination of the immediate area, the timing, and the people present, while resisting the rush to unproven conclusions. Start with the moment itself, a child on a sand mound at 5 in the afternoon. Kids play, they dart, they crouch and explore. In a station environment, a sand mound is as mundane as a garden swing in a suburb, but the surroundings are very different. Wide open country, minimal shelter, and a landscape that erases its own traces quickly. The last certain sighting is not a full narrative, it is a direction. Investigators must treat that sighting like a compass needle and map out every possible corridor a small child might have taken in the ensuing minutes. Small details matter. Which mound was it? Which side of the mound was he on? What toys or visual cues were nearby? Which adults were within earshot? And what precisely happened between the call for him and the moment family members concluded an intrusive absence? Those tiny facts determine which zones remain high priority for reinspection, which microterrain features could conceal prints or items, and where disturbed ground might hide more than just a shallow depression. Now at a pressure point, the disappearance coincided with the end of the AFL Grand Final. In many households, that is a time when attention is divided. People move between screens, phones ping with final scores, and small distractions can stretch into half hours. The coincidence does not prove causation, but it is an important contextual factor because even brief divided attention can open an otherwise safe moment to danger. Investigators working in rural contexts repeatedly emphasize that routine activity patterns shape what is considered supervision. In a city, a caregiver might check a child every 5 minutes. On a station, a parent or grandparent might reasonably expect a child to remain nearby while they check stock or equipment a short distance away. That cultural difference matters for assessing timelines and for understanding why a child could be unsupervised for a critical half hour. The timing of a major public event makes those human rhythms particularly relevant to reconstructing what did and did not happen during those first minutes. Perhaps the most troubling empirical fact in early reporting is the absence of definitive physical traces at the scene. Searchers and trackers described a lack of continuous footprints, no obvious scent trails for tracking dogs, and no clothing, toys, or items clearly associated with Gus. In an outdoor disappearance, that feature set is deeply unsettling because it eliminates the more straightforward scenarios. A child wandering, leaving an obvious trail, an animal encounter leaving torn clothing, or a stumble into a thorn patch leaving a path of debris. The Outback both preserves and erases. It preserves large disturbances, but wind, passing vehicles, and even the boots of dozens of volunteers can quickly soften and blur a faint, child-sized print. That reality makes the early decisions about how the first responses were conducted, who walked where, which areas were cordoned, whether prints were cast or photographed immediately, central to evaluating what remains investigable now. If the first responders did not secure and document potential traces, the land may have lost the evidence before forensic teams could preserve it. Alongside the lack of clear traces, a worrying set of fresh excavations and uncordoned holes near the homestead have been reported. Open, recently disturbed holes are both a safety hazard for children and potentially crucial from an evidentiary point of view. Investigators must treat any freshly dug earth with the same scrutiny they give any potential trace. Who dug those holes, when were they dug, what tools were used, and whether any materials from the excavation were removed or left on site. Fresh building materials, bags of sand, new soil, timber offcuts, concrete or gravel, are the kinds of things that might be used inadvertently or deliberately to conceal a small object or to fill an indentation. The presence of unmarked holes also raises the practical hazard that a child could fall into one and be hidden by material or heat-softened earth. Because these are operationally and morally significant questions, they should be investigated by forensic teams with care, documenting soil stratigraphy, comparing soil samples, and checking whether the pits were open at the time Gus was last seen. For the family and for the public, the sight of such excavations near the homestead naturally produces anxiety. For investigators, they are testable leads that must be checked and either ruled out or confirmed. Media reports and family statements have converged on a basic chronology. Gus was alone for about 30 minutes before anyone realized he was missing. The brevity of that window is simultaneously hopeful and chilling. Hopeful because 30 minutes is a short time if immediate rescue options are mobilized. Chilling because in remote terrain that same time can be enough for tracks to vanish, for the sun to eat heat signatures, and for a child to move into an unsafe area. Analysts often compare this pattern to other cases where construction activity or fresh excavations near residences complicated both the search and the evidence record. In those analogous circumstances, investigators learned to treat the disturbed ground as a potential locus of concealment or of accidental entrapment. They test whether soil, fresh sand, or building materials match deposits found in other areas, and whether any tools or vehicles used for digging appeared in the vicinity in relevant windows. Those comparisons are not meant to suggest conclusions here. They are offered as a template for the sorts of checks that might yield new information when physical traces at the main scene are sparse. Given those parallels, a straightforward recommendation arises. Recheck every recent dig, every pile of fresh soil, and any unsecured hole around the homestead and nearby yards. That re-examination must be methodical. Forensic teams should create a record of all disturbed soil, photograph, map and collect samples for granulometry and comparison. Any new material should be cross-checked against the site for matching soil composition, matching tool marks or fingerprints, and any fibers or materials that could link a disturbance to a movement. Investigators should also interview anyone who worked on the property recently, contractors, station hands, neighbors, and passing workers who might have legitimate reasons to be there but whose timing may coincide with the disappearance. The crucial point is not to accuse, but to exhaust the physical possibilities. In cases where the visible scene is skeletal, nearby disturbances are the obvious next place to test. Another vital question concerns the deployment and effectiveness of scent tracking dogs. When tracks are faint or absent, trained dogs can sometimes pick up a scent gross pattern or mark an area that deserves closer inspection. But dogs' effectiveness depends on many variables. Whether they were brought to the precise area quickly, the weather and wind conditions, whether previous foot traffic contaminated the scent field, and how handlers interpreted canine alerts. The public deserves transparency on whether scent dogs were used, where they were deployed, and what results, if any, those deployments produced. If dogs were not used promptly or in the right places, or if their deployments were not recorded and explained, investigators should consider redeploying canine units to areas that have been newly cordoned or re-examined, particularly around fresh excavations and material piles. Again, this is not about second-guessing heroics, but about ensuring that every scientifically plausible method has been tried and properly documented. Confronting the darkest hypothesis raised in public discussion, that a body might have been concealed near the property using available materials, requires careful language and strict ethical handling. It is critical to say, this is a hypothesis to be tested, not an accusation to be circulated as fact. Historically, in several missing person cases where initial traces are absent, investigators have found disturbed earth, hastily filled pits or concealed deposits that later yielded evidence. When the physical record at a main scene is meager, concealment nearby is an unfortunately plausible avenue that must be examined. But the investigative imperative is to do so through proper forensic protocols, secure the area, avoid contaminating potential scenes, take comparative soil samples, and, where warranted, use ground-penetrating radar or careful excavation performed by trained personnel under lawful authority. Public discussion of this hypothesis must avoid instructive detail and must not encourage vigilantism. It should instead press authorities to allocate resources to check these possibilities rigorously and transparently. The narrative thread that ties these points together is time. The precise timing of the disappearance, the exact minutes when Gus was last seen, when subsequent checks occurred, when the family began a private search, and when police were notified, is the central investigative clue. Every secondary lead must be read against that chronology. If freshly dug soil was created before or during that window, or if a vehicle passed the homestead within those minutes, those are testable facts that can be corroborated by fuel receipts, CCTV dashcam captures, or phone metadata. If scent dogs were deployed only after several hours of volunteer movement across the site, that explains why tracking might have failed. If construction materials arrived the same day, the provenance of those materials is a data point worth checking. In short, time binds otherwise disparate facts into lines investigators can follow or rule out. From that logic follow several operational takeaways for investigators and for the public. First, map the timeline precisely and publish a verified chronology to the extent possible without compromising the investigation. That transparency reduces rumor and helps the public provide targeted tips. Second, conduct a full forensic reinspection of every fresh excavation and uncordoned hole near the homestead using appropriate tools, photography, sediment sampling, and, if indicated, non-invasive scanning. Third, clarify and, if needed, redeploy scent tracking units with documented handlers and clear logbooks so canine results are auditable. Fourth, compile and cross-check all vehicle movements, deliveries, and visitors around the property in the hours before and after 5 p.m., including fuel, work orders, and neighbor testimonies. Fifth, communicate publicly what has been checked and what remains open. That builds community trust and channels attention away from unverified speculation toward verifiable action. Finally, there is a humane reality. families and small communities facing a disappearance live with both grief and the corrosive effects of rumor. Calls for speculation about concealment or motive can wound people and impede cooperation. Public conversation should emphasize verified facts and the kinds of assistance that actually help, checking old footage with timestamps, reviewing dashcam logs, remembering precise vehicle descriptions, and contacting police with concrete information rather than amplifying sensational theories. At the same time, compassion does not excuse overlooking plausible investigative avenues. It demands both rigorous checking of the physical scene and restraint in how we talk about possibilities until they are substantiated. The disappearance of a small child in remote terrain is a tight knot of time, place, and human action. The precise timing of Gus's last sighting, the emergence of fresh excavations nearby, the absence of obvious traces at the scene, and the potential limits of early tracking efforts together create a set of testable hypotheses. Investigators should prioritize careful re-examination of disturbed soil and uncordoned holes, transparent information about canine deployments, and a tight reconstruction of the minutes that matter. The public can help most by offering verifiable, time-stamped leads to police and by avoiding the spread of unconfirmed conjecture. Above all, this is a time for disciplined investigation and for measured, compassionate public support. Both are needed if the community is to move from questions to answers.